I'm excited to introduce our next panel, led by my colleague, Professor Foster Provost, the Ira Rennert Professor of Entrepreneurship. And in addition to his many academic achievements, last year, Professor Provost famously interviewed an AI bot seeking a data science job. And that video now has like 50,000 hits on YouTube. So he's at the bleeding edge of AI applications, and he's built multiple successful AI-driven products and businesses. So he's going to lead our next panel, which is entitled, What Makes a Good Commercial Application for Generative AI? And he'll introduce his fellow panelists. Professor?
All right, thanks a lot, Kathleen, and welcome everyone to our third panel of the morning. Yeah, as Kathleen said, over the next 50 minutes or so, we will be examining this question: what makes a good commercial application for generative AI, right? Where we see all manner of application ideas in the media, some of which seem like they're just waiting for somebody to build them, and other ones you think, why would you think that would actually work? And I wanted to start by just pointing out that so I wear these two hats, right? I'm a researcher and then I'm a practitioner. And just because something really looks great in the research or in the demo does not necessarily mean that it's going to end up being a great, successful commercial application. I think a really good example of this would be self-driving cars. You know, when I was in grad school toward the end of the 80s, you know, there were self-driving. The Nav Lab was driving around open roads, self-driving around the Shenley Park in Pittsburgh. You know, and we would sit there and talk about it and all the great commercial success that was going to come from it and what would be the applications. And here we are, more than 35 years later, maybe more than 30 years later, and you know, we still don't have a successful commercial application of self-driving cars, really. I was trying to look to see if we had truck trains in Australia were successfully commercial, but I couldn't figure that out. And I think the same thing goes for LLM-based systems. LLM-based systems, for instance, as people have mentioned, are great at document summarization. But whether a particular product or services that employs AI document summarization is a good idea depends on factors about the application. So, for example, the product's accuracy requirement. Right, all AI systems make mistakes. So if the accuracy requirement for the application is higher than the accuracy of the system, this is a particularly bad scenario. Document summarization. Why? Because actually, to check a document summarization, it takes you have to incur almost as much cost as actually creating the document summary, because you have to read the human would have to read the document, right? You know, if the accuracy requirement allows the kind of errors that the document summarization system would make, which possibly are small, yeah, then maybe it would be a good application. Okay, so what are we going to do? Kathleen mentioned, yeah, I've been involved. Involved with building a whole bunch of successful AI applications, and I've been involved in a bunch of really super cool generative AI products. But I've never basically built a commercially successful generative AI application. And so we have some people who have, and those are going to be our panelists. All three of our panelists are experts in AI and generative AI, Ph.D. level. I'll introduce them specifically as we go along, and they're all basically either have or are building and deploying applications. The panelists, I'll give a quick intro now, and then as we go along, I'll give their more detailed intro. And so we have Alex Jaimes, Chief Scientist and Senior Vice President of AI at Dataminr. We have Alex Sugar, a senior product manager who spent half a decade at LexCheck. And we have Daniel Preotiuc-Pietro, manager of the AI NLP group at Bloomberg. And so the way this is going to run is we'll start with each of them giving an example of a commercial application of generative AI, and then along with some words about the panel's main question: what makes this, a good commercial application, or perhaps what insights about that, and then we're going to have a discussion among the whole panel. And remember, you can put questions into the Q&A feature in Zoom. I can't guarantee that we're going to get to all of them, given how the time goes, and I'll have some questions myself, but we'll get to some of them. So we're going to go in the following order: Alex first, Alex Jaimes, that is, then Alex Sugar, and then finally Daniel. All right. So Dr. Alejandro Jaimes. I probably am not going to cover your entire bio because Alex has been around, sort of doing really cool stuff for forever, and I want to leave time for him to actually speak. He's, as I mentioned, he's chief scientist and SVP of AI at Dataminr, where he's in charge of the AI platform, which includes engineering, data, and research teams. He's been building AI products for a long time that are used by millions of people, including at IBM, at Yahoo, at Telefonica, at Fuji, Xerox, at Siemens, at AT&T, and more. That's just where I ran out of breath. He is a thought leader in AI for decades as well, and has been featured broadly in the media. His PhD is from Columbia University, by the way, so that's about as much time as I want to take. So welcome, Alex, and thanks for taking the time to be in with us. How about kicking it off?
Thank you. Excited to be here. So let's just get right into it because we don't have a lot of time. I'm going to talk about Dataminr first and what the application actually is and what we do. In essence, what we do is we ingest data from public data sources. We find events in those data sources, and then we send out alerts about events that are important within those data sources. The types of events that we alert on have a very wide range. We have 3 verticals that we work on: public sector, corporate risk, and news and journalism. The public sector events mainly focus on emergency response events, so events that require emergency response. Traffic accidents, hurricanes, COVID-19, anything that requires emergency response. Corporate risk is similar to the ones that I just described, but they're events that are of interest to companies that impact the safety of their employees, their executives, or impact their assets. So this might include cyber attacks, executive protection, et cetera, et cetera. And finally, news and journalism covers events that are newsworthy. And so this can range from any of the previous ones all the way up to celebrity news, market moves, political statements, anything that have an impact. So we ingest over 1 million data sources, where X or Twitter is counted as one of those million, to give you an idea of the scale. And it's images, video, audio, sensor data, and text in different languages from all over the world, different kinds of platforms, web, dark web, social media. So it's worldwide coverage. So in essence, we're collecting this information. It's by essence multimodal. We're detecting those events, and we need to get the information about those events in a concise way that makes sense to first responders or to our customers and security teams or to journalists who will then write articles and respond depending on the importance of an event. So here's an example where that information might come fragmented and disparate. In a rural area, somebody hears an explosion, so they call 911. We pick up the audio and we said, okay, there's an event where an explosion was heard. Somebody else maybe sees fire from far away. It's in the middle of the night. They don't know what happened. So we pick that signal up from social media, and then flight-aware data, which has GPS location from every commercial flight, tells us that there was an anomaly on the flight. All of these pieces individually don't tell us the full story, but when we put them together, they tell us that a flight might have come down, and so emergency response and journalists and corporations will get the information regarding that particular event. So the power of synthesizing all of that information into a single description is really, really critical. In general, AI can be put into categories: predictive and generative. At Dataminr, the predictive part deals with the detections. We have many, many models to detect the events and detect the labels of the events and predict those labels. They're all past events or events that just happened. We're not in the business of predicting future events, just to be clear. And the generative AI takes all of that information and generates a summary of what the event was, what exactly happened, so that it's in a consumable way. So just briefly, I want to talk about BERT and Friends, because people forget that even though ChatGPT was launched in November 22, large language models have been around for a long time, and open source models have been around for a long time. So we put LLMs in production at Dataminr in 2019 to generate those descriptions. So given an event, we generate a 1-sentence description of the event. That description is fully automated in many, many cases, in majority of the cases, and that's done using a large language model. Fast forward to today, one of the things that has changed is that there are many, many more models out there. They're much larger. And so using these large models is complicated, it's expensive. And so our strategy has been to take those models, those open source models, and adapt them using our own data. To be able to succeed in this, we've needed to invest over many years tons of money in proprietary data, expertise and processes to swap different models in and out, to optimize them, to adapt them, and then compute and infrastructure. So when people ask me about deploying LLMs and using them in production, I would say there's no free lunch and there's no single formula, but there is a pattern where you can consume content that comes from applications that are built using LLM and LLMs or AI. And in our case, many of our customers, that's what they do when they get their alerts. So there are many consumer-facing B2B applications and many free, low-cost options like Gemini and Bing Chat, et cetera, et cetera. You can also use public APIs. Some of them are closed, right? They're low cost for very low volume, but they get very expensive very quickly at a scale like ours. And I'm talking $2,000 versus $8 million a day for a small subset of models. Then you have the open source models that can be used as foundation models. Typically, you have to adapt them so that they're accurate enough for your use case and efficient enough. And then finally, you have your custom models. So depending on where you are and what your needs are, your per unit cost at scale goes down, but your technical skills increase. So I'll close with that. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Alex. I'm gonna hold my questions until we go through all the panelists. And so next we have Dr. Alexander Sugar. Alec is a linguist by training. He received his Ph.D. from University of Wisconsin, and for over half a decade worked in various roles at LexCheck, most recently senior group product manager. LexCheck, by the way, provides AI-based software and services for contract review and negotiation. And I was particularly interested in having Alec on the panel because I've run into generative AI applications in the legal profession repeatedly, including in particular contract review. And I kind of thought of this as sounds really hard to me, and so I'd like to hear some of the details. And so thanks so much for joining us, Alec. Take it away.
So thank you for that introduction. I was at a legal tech startup, as Foster mentioned, and our product was contract review, and we primarily sold to in-house counsels at large corporations that handled high volumes of thousands of contracts every year. I assume there's a variety of familiarity with contracts in the audience, but the two important points are that there's, somewhat, contracts use a specialized language. It has a lot of overlap between contracts, but there are finer points of variation between a given provision that appears across contracts, and those differences matter a lot to the customers. The other thing that's really important about contracts is that the language has to be airtight. There's not a lot of room for freelancing or variation or hallucinations in AI terms, because this language is going to be scrutinized by lawyers to avoid potential legal repercussions. And basically the way these systems work, and I'm speaking in general terms about contract review, general here, is that the user is going to upload one or more documents. This could be by email usually, or by web platform or web application. And after the AI system makes these edits, according to a legal playbook, it's going to be returned to the user either directly by email as a red line document. You can think of track changes in Word, or there's going to be some sort of platform where the user can review those red line edits and accept or reject the changes. When I say legal playbook here, by the way, I'm talking about a set of guidelines. This language can or can't be here. Make sure that this provision is included. Make sure that the term of the agreement is between 2 to 3 years, but not longer, etc. So I'm going to just briefly talk about some common generative AI tasks that are relevant for contract review and give some concluding remarks. And I'll kind of gloss over details because time is limited. You can move to the second slide now, or the next slide. Yeah, so one of the main tasks that Foster mentioned in his introduction is document summarization. This is something that generative AI is generally thought to perform well at. And it does perform well for contract review within certain confines. So what's useful, from customers that I worked with, is getting some key facts, especially key figures, out of their contract that they can look at a glance. I can see, when does this contract expire? What happens when it expires? and quickly move through. It's also helpful to have data across documents I've been editing, so that I can see, in the past when this type of contract has come in, did we accept this term or not? I can go off of precedent and more quickly move to the next round of negotiation, since the ultimate goal here is to make the negotiation process happen much more quickly. What's not as useful, to customers, in my experience, is just having a paragraph description of here's what the contract says. In terms of where generative AI performs well versus where it struggles, it performs well when there's information, either it's a numerical figure that's found in a predictable place in the document, or is coming from some closed class. And by closed class, I mean there's a finite set of possible output that can be returned to it for a query. So, there's how many years does the term of the agreement last? Is there not an automatic renewal, are two common ones. Where the AI can struggle and return unhelpful results is when it's asked to get information from an open class, when there's an unlimited possibility of answers. Questions like, what are the blank in the contract? And you're trying to return some limited piece of text that the user can look at quickly to get the information they need to proceed. All right, next slide. The second area is, and this is a very broad category here, there can be a lot of subdivisions, but making provisions conform to a standard template. So, a legal counsel, especially at a large company, is going to have very fixed guidelines for what they're allowed to accept and not accept in contracts that's advantageous to them. And there's a variety of edits that can be made here, between adding text that needs to be there that's missing, making smaller edits within a provision to make sure that it meets guidelines. And generative AI can be very helpful in this area. One common use case we see is making a provision mutual. Maybe there's a provision that says that one party is going to be liable for X, Y, and Z. We want to change that to say either party can be liable. It's a non-trivial task. It's not just changing the party name. It can also be changing verbs throughout that provision to agree with a different subject, making sure that references back to the same parties all correspond well to each other. Another area is completing lists. This is where, say we have a non-disclosure agreement and there's some exclusions to the definition of what's confidential information. And, A, B, and C all need to be present. Some documents are going to have A and B, but not C there. Some are going to have A and C, but not B, etc. And using, a more traditional, say, rule-based type system to cover each combination and add the missing information can become a mess. Whereas generative AI, if given that whole provision, can maybe more quickly and accurately make the document still contain all the pieces without adding unnecessary information. Now, where AI struggles here, one area is limiting the scope of edits to be in the right provision. So the contracts we handle can range in size from just a couple of pages in an NDA to being over 100 pages in different types of service agreements. And often generative AI, if given a whole document, will go ahead and apply edits to provisions we didn't want, to parts of the document that weren't relevant. So it's important to feed into it only the relevant piece. It's also very important to use consistent terminology through the document. Usually at the beginning of a contract and throughout, sometimes terms are going to be defined. We're going to use this term to refer to one party, this term to refer to another party. Any named entity in the document needs to have a consistent name. And related to the previous issue, if we're only providing a part of the document to, say, a large language model to make an edit, not the entire document, we need to give it the information about what terms to use if they're not already present in that text, so that we don't end up with inconsistent language throughout. And then, of course, there's a general problem of more edits being applied than necessary. Maybe we wanted to just make a small change to what's considered the definition of confidential information, but we get unexpected edits throughout because it's not a deterministic model. That's the second category. You can go to the next slide. And the third broad category I want to mention here is just flagging or removing unwanted content. It's very important to alert users to language that would put their company at a disadvantage in the agreement. And again, for strengths here, most models out the box are good at recognizing very common provisions that you see across any document. And they perform especially better than sort of more traditional approaches when you have cases like this provision can only mention one thing. We can only have our liability limited for one type of damage, and anything else needs to be flagged. If you have a rule-based system, it's very hard to just capture anything other than scenario. But with a large language model, if there's data that's been provided in a large training set, you can very quickly recognize and flag that language, bring it to the user's attention so they can either remove it or bring it to another team to consult about it. Where there's a struggle here is with the cost of checking an entire document to look for unwanted language. That's costly in terms of token usage for a large language model, in terms of overall processing time, et cetera. And sometimes companies care very much about certain language not being in a document that, because it's so harmful, is very rare, and therefore it doesn't occur often in training sets. And so additional training is needed. Next slide. So in general terms, we find that large language models perform well out of the box for common types of edits to common provisions that can take a lot of time for humans to make. More bespoke and custom edits usually require some additional training. So this involves a data collection process, labeling, et cetera, and high token usage. Go ahead and go to the next slide here, and I'll make the general remarks. So to answer the question, is contract review a good commercial application? It is, but it's most effective in combination with other tools. The training time can be lengthy if you're training your own models, so you need to have a runway. And I think it's very important when a document is first processed to capture key pieces of the document, usually segmenting by provision. You can then feed in strategically as you're making edits along this playbook. And I think it's very important to focus on how the generative AI is consumed. Maybe most importantly, give the user an interactive platform where they can review the edits. They can see the piece of the document where it's coming in and very quickly check if it's accurate, and it still saves them time. So happy to answer more in the Q&A, but thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Alec. Okay, and so next we have Dr. Daniel Preotiuc-Pietro, who is a senior research scientist and the manager of NLP platforms at Bloomberg AI Engineering. His team builds models and libraries that power NLP products for Bloomberg stuff, news, financial documents, social media, and search across the Bloomberg terminal, and also enterprise applications. Daniel's been at Bloomberg for working on AI for more than 7 years. He got his Ph.D. from the University of Sheffield in the UK, was a postdoctoral researcher at Penn, and has written and published a lot of research papers as well. So very glad to have you, Daniel. Thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And yeah, first of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me to be part of this event and to be able to share some of the knowledge gained while developing products at Bloomberg. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I just have some screenshots from one of the products that I wanted to talk about. But first, I want to give some context about why we use AI at Bloomberg. So our users need to parse and understand massive amounts of unstructured data, and that includes news stories, press releases, social media, or financial reports, company earnings, regulatory filings. And overall, we ingest more than 1.5 million stories in over 30 languages from over 125,000 sources from around the globe, in addition to more than 2 million other financial documents every day. Since 2009, Bloomberg made significant investments in AI research, infrastructure, and product development to help digest and organize all this information and make it more readily accessible and actionable to our customers. And AI techniques enable us to improve the speed of discoverability for crucial information through extraction, enrichment, search, and summarization. And I'm part of a 300+ person AI engineering group that helps build the underlying NLP infrastructure and products that make use of this technology. But today, in particular, I want to talk about one of the recent products that we released last month to all Bloomberg terminal clients, named AI-powered earning call summaries. And it's the first solution we've built that uses generative AI. And I'm sure most of you are already aware of what earning calls are and why they're important to investors, but I just want to give a quick recap. Earning calls are held by the majority of public companies every quarter, during which the business and financial leadership of the companies update investors and analysts on the performance of the company. And these calls are closely watched by financial professionals for insights and can impact the market. The average earning call takes around 45 to 60 minutes and contains between 5,000 and 10,000 words. So you can imagine that's a lot of time for analysts to consume, especially if they're covering multiple sectors, multiple domains. So at its core, the product embraces the concept of summarization, but the summarization that we do is not simply a generic summary of a long document into a short one, because that would neither satisfy most of the information needs of our clients or save much time, because they want to be able to answer specific questions about the company's performance by looking at the document. So primarily, we see this product as a productivity tool, since it helps analysts with their research process by enabling them to quickly extract these key insights from the transcript. So, for example, here in the screenshot that I'm showing, these are all the documents, and I picked NVIDIA just because it's more popular nowadays. And you can see all the different documents, that presentations and transcripts that they have, and this includes the earning calls that happened recently. So I want to focus on three aspects that we focused on while we developed this product, and this is how the product looks. So this is the earning call. Here, these are the participants. You can see these are also linked using extractive methods. You can hear the audio, you can sync this to the text. And on the left-hand panel, you can see various insights, including these summaries. So three aspects that we focused on while we developed. First of all, domain expertise. So we use domain experts from our Bloomberg Intelligence department and their understanding of earning calls, and tried to anticipate what questions about business performance are more important to our users. So from that point of view, the summaries are contextualized, grounded, and focused on relevant financial questions about topics that are commonly addressed in these earning calls. And these includes example here like guidance, capital allocation, macro environment, and there could be other things like new products, supply chains, or customer demand. So you can view this task rather than generic summarization, as query-focused summarization, or you can even think of it as retrieval augmented generation, only that the retrieval is performed within a single lengthy document rather than across multiple documents or multiple sources. And in addition to this, in terms of domain knowledge, we also show that the application connects insights to additional data or additional knowledge that can provide tie-ins with other products that we have. So an example here includes links to other Bloomberg functions where you can actually see more of these numbers, and you can get context about how the other companies are doing. So this includes like our function on company financials or MODL, buybacks, dividend forecasts, and so on, which are linked in the appropriate places next to where the summary is generated. The second aspect I wanted to mention is factuality, because inherently any person, let alone model, doing summarization could cause information loss or could not faithfully replicate what was being presented. So when building any AI products, especially in the financial domain, we have to take special care that the content is as accurate and faithful as possible, and we are constantly measuring factuality, faithfulness, and other factors, and already took steps to ensure that important information, such as revenue numbers, are not distorted in the summary. And the third aspect I want to touch upon is transparency. Which is about providing user more information about why something is shown in the first place. In particular, this product makes it possible for users to click on each summary point in the sidebar, like this one, and then they can easily jump to the corresponding excerpts in the call transcript, and they can also actually hear the original recording synced to it. And this is enabled by using a combination of sparse, dense vector approaches that identify the right passages in the transcripts, and they're actually used in the first place for doing the summarization. But more generally, for our generative AI product, we believe the more insights our users can have on the system's logic, function, and limitation, the more likely they are to be useful, and the users will also trust them more. So yeah, those were the key points I want to mention today, and I look forward to the questions.
Okay, thanks a lot. And one of the things that I sort of see from all the applications, which has also been my experience in my non-commercial LLM based applications, is right. Unlike what we might see, where everyone's talking about how to prompt engineer ChatGPT to do something, right? All these products seem to be very much AI systems that are built that are using the AI, the LLM tactically as a component, rather than trying to get the AI to somehow or other be so smart that it can actually solve the problem itself. So I'm going to ask some specific questions, and I'll just go in reverse order, partially because Alex's question is the most general. So Daniel, I mean, one of the things that came up in the discussion that you and I had before, and it also is related to some stuff that was in the prior segments of the conference today. Talk a little about like, where do you see in the overall process of building products that the generative AI can play sort of maybe the biggest or just an outsized role?
Yeah, so I think it's actually pretty interesting discussion we started having, because I think with the latest models, especially the instruction-tuned large language models, I think the barrier for putting up a prototype or something like decreased a lot. So right now, someone can, as you mentioned, someone would, you can try out the prompt, you can tweak it quickly, you can get some results out which seem plausible. And that makes the product more tangible early on. So we don't have to, gather a lot of training data in order to get an initial version. And then if we want to tweak it, and that's not what we want. For example, you can see in our product, we have bullet points, but for example, we could have prose, or we can have different other styles of summaries. Then that's very easy to test. And it's good for the developers to get a grasp, to quickly test this with clients, with UX, to see what's the best form factor. And then once we arrive at something that we think looks good, then we can fully develop and fully customize the model. So I think from that point of view, the barrier to putting out a prototype has lowered dramatically, I think.
In other words, AI for the purpose of rapid prototype design, rather than in addition to, right? But rather than AI actually being incorporated as a unit within the product. I thought that was pretty cool. So, I wanted to continue with Alec and talk about this UX kind of, the idea of the UX, because if we're talking about like the success of the product from the point of view of the legal document review, right? And I got this idea from you, but it seems like how the UX, what is the user experience actually is going to be kind of really important for the success of the product, whether the user's in there working interactively versus maybe sending a document in by email and then they have to get an email response. I wonder if you could talk a little more about that?
Sure. Yeah, I think a key issue, as I alluded to earlier, is having trust in the AI system to make proper edits, right? And for a lawyer to be confident signing off on their drafted agreement before sending it on to the counterparty, or before putting their signature on it. And if the most traditional system would just be to return an email with a red line document as if a human had gone through and reviewed it. And there's some inevitable cost there in just going through line by line the whole document there, checking each edit, hoping that everything is properly captured in a red line so it's easily visible, and then signing off. A more helpful way to do this is to have some sort of web platform where the user can kind of review provision by provision maybe go off of their guidance, their template, and see that each item is conforming, see where that's conforming, and kind of quickly jump through the document rather than just going through line by line. What's even more helpful, I think, is after a given single contract has been reviewed, is adding that to some sort of repository or database where that information is captured and where they can see general trends. And not only can they then, determine how to make a decision about a particular provision that comes up in a document, but they can maybe consider revising their own template because they see they always push back on a certain term but end up agreeing to it in the end, and they can actually streamline their negotiation down the road.
Cool. And for the sake of time, I want to move on to my more general question for Alex. So, Alex, you've been doing this for a long time, and I'm wondering, with your perspective, both on the research side and just basically being in industry, developing products and services with AI, long before, I guess, probably arguably the first large language model was in 2003 in the research side of things, and you were, delivering AI products even before that, right? I'm curious about what you're thinking about the future of actual commercial applications with generative AI. How optimistic you are, and in particular, do you think there's going to be a significant ramp up in productivity of the level kind of we hear in the when people who aren't really experts are talking about it, or is it going to be more like it could be like it's just a big bust, but or it could also just be like AI has always been, where like we find some applications and we work hard to develop products. Yeah. So where on this spectrum are you from your
I'm very optimistic. I think that these three use cases are a perfect example of areas where it can have very significant impact in productivity. In our case, in emergency response, which can save lives. So very positive impact, but I do think it's going to be impactful across every industry. On one hand, you can think of it as a productivity tool, right? Where we're still beginning to learn how to use it and how to deploy it and how to build business models around it. So I think that will continue to evolve and mature over time, both on the technical front as well as on the business side and on the application side. Users of this technology are being educated very, very quickly, right? A year, before ChatGPT, no one outside of, a core community of experts really was playing around with these systems. Now, a lot of, you might get an Uber and the Uber driver, I use ChatGPT. Mm-hmm. And it's a bit like the web at the very beginning, where maybe people are not quite sure how to use it, how to leverage it. And so there are a lot of opportunities for new applications that we hadn't thought of. There are a lot of applications that are already there where this can make things faster, lower the costs, make them more efficient, et cetera, et cetera. But there's the user component as well, where I think the people using these technologies will be better at using them and leveraging them and interact with them. So I don't think there's like one single killer application. I think there are many, and overall, I would say in large parts it's a productivity tool, but it is going to enable many new things that we haven't thought about yet. And I think we're still kind of in a big experiment, except in very specific use cases like these three.
Thanks. Let me actually go to some of the questions in the Q&A. Tyler Gross, who always asks a great question, asks us, is the cost of computing or operating the AI a challenge for your organization? And if so, how big a challenge is it? And how would you go about addressing it? Maybe a lightning round on these things so that we don't waste, it's not waste, but don't spend all our time on one question. Anyone want to, sort of jump in on how big a challenge is the cost of compute?
So since I brought it up at the beginning, I'm just going to go first. It's a challenge for every organization. It just depends on the stage you're at and your scale. So it's not specific to Dataminr. So if you're just building a startup, as I think it was Daniel who said, you can easily build a prototype. then initially you don't need to worry too much about that because you're just building the prototype, the demo to raise some money. But as soon as you start scaling, you're going to have to shift because the cost differential is still huge. I gave you one example where for a very small subset of our models, if we were to use a public API, we would spend about $8 million a day versus about 2,000, which is what we spent with our own customized models. So that gives you a scale of the difference. The cost of the API public models is going to go down, but I think the gap will be big enough that for most companies at scale, you're going to have to do things differently. And so open source, compute, and a lot of knowledge and your own data are the key to success there.
So maybe I can add one more thing, but before seeing if Alec and Daniel maybe want to add, but that is when we're talking about productivity improvements, right? You know, we think a lot about. I mean, maybe I'm the only one who does this, but think a lot about the like the reduction in the amount of human resources we have to expend on something, right? But there's the other side of the story here is that we also have to increase the resources. One of them is compute, right? So if the thing is actually costly for us to run, you know, maybe $8 million in the extreme case that you mentioned, right? You know, we have to balance that out. But there are also new human costs that come in. And so, for instance, on one of the applications that I've been working on, right, you actually have to get people to go in and look at different things than they would have looked at otherwise, and then that's costly. And so maybe when we're if Alec or Daniel have something to say, maybe we can include not just the compute costs, but more kind of new costs that are coming in.
Sure. Yeah, I second everything that Alex and Foster said. First of all, I think in terms of compute costs, in the case of contracts, when your contracts can be lengthy and we're handling an extremely high volume of them, we do want to reduce the number of times we're making a pass, whether it's generative AI or any other tool, how many times it's making a pass over this long document to answer a certain question or generate a certain output. And I think that the lightning answer is to carefully segment the document up front before running other operations. That would be my comment. And then I think Foster, sorry, you mentioned the human cost. I think sometimes users' attention in the case of contract review gets directed towards new types of edits that they wouldn't have to think about because they're now controlling for hallucinations. And there's a long answer that I won't share here for how to deal with that.
Yeah, I would second everything that was mentioned, but I would also want to add another new area, which is the MLOps. So all the operations related to managing models, managing data, and that's a relatively new field, and that's also been expanding.
Yeah, great, thanks. So right, so when we're thinking about our question, whether it's a good commercial application, right? I think the summary is there's now ML ops that's going to be an investment that we're going to have to make. If there's human, for instance, you might have to have humans go in and help you to identify whether or not what is the level of accuracy. You have this thing, it's not so easy to automatically judge how accurate things are with generation, right? And so now you may have to employ people to go in and continue to do that. And then there's the actual, sometimes substantial cost of running things. Yeah, so we're coming down to the end of our time. Maybe I should just ask you all about. This was a question from Narander about can you say a few lightning round again on the feedback experience of customers actually using these products?
Sorry,
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, it was mentioned Bloomberg specific. So this product was launched in January. So there has been relatively limited amount of time for people to use this, but from initial trials, it's been very positive. And somehow with this generative AI trend, people expect and are more educated also in how to use these systems. So I think it's a good time to develop more products.
Alec or Alex?
Yeah, it's a very exciting time to use generative AI for any of these applications. And I think in this, I'm sure this is true of any type of application, but I've felt it acutely in the contract review space, that there's a tendency, in the public mindset to put AI on a pedestal and think that AI is the end all, is going to do everything perfectly. And the reality is, as already been mentioned, it's a very useful tool to leverage in discrete places to speed up the processes that we're already working on.
So one mistake that I think people make is they think of AI or generative AI as a single application and a single component, but any real world application is actually a system. So when you disturb that system, things move up and down and shift here and there. And that goes to answering Foster's question around, you increase the cost of compute and then you increase the costs elsewhere, you reduce them in somewhere else. You look at the system as a whole. And one of the things that's most exciting about this is that it's really a combination between human and AI. So human AI collaboration becomes even more critical in Gen AI applications, whether they're in the background in training the models, improving them, doing QA, or with the end user who will have then tools like in the legal use case or in the Bloomberg use case. With us, as I said, we've been doing this since 2019 on the generative AI part, but we have launched a new product. We're currently in beta testing, and the feedback has been amazing. And it's not only what it does in summarizing very complex events. Like I got one last night from what's happening in Chad. There was an assassination attempt, there was an assassination, and there was a cyber attack. In a single summary, I get all of that. That explains all that happened. It's being updated in real time every time a new piece of information comes in. So the experience is going to change significantly, and I see this happening across many areas. And I did want to touch on the knowledge graphs. Absolutely critical. We have a very large knowledge graph that we keep investing in because that helps us with accuracy and making sure that the summaries that this platform produces are high quality.
All right. Well, our time is up. Thank you guys so much for coming, and it was great talking to you beforehand as well. Appreciate it very much, and look forward to talking to you some more in the future.